Captain Rip Hayman is a true licensed master mariner. In researching his careers, and I use the plural deliberately, I kept coming across raves like an adventurer who has sailed the 7 seas and dozens of rivers in various vessels, from sea schooners in the Pacific to kayaks in the Amazon to icebreakers in Antarctica. Captain Rip Hayman is a true world explorer. I got another clue when I checked out his LinkedIn profile. He very succinctly notes, sailor from birth. Fascinating, but even more so when we encounter the cutting-edge cultural arts side of our captain, who is also a performance artist and composer. Captain Rip has worked in the cruise business since 1981, starting with Lindblad Travel as lecturer and cruise director for their Arctic, Antarctic, and Asian destinations. A river navigation specialist, Captain Rip has written the Coastal Harbor Guide to the United States, soon to be published on CD for electronic navigation. He is equally at home on the China's Yangtze River, about which he has written several works, including Yangtze River Map from source to sea and 3 gorges of the Yangtze River, a region he's also walked through for ground truth. He was instrumental in establishing the first cruise fleet on the Yangtze. He's also traveled extensively in South America, visiting Patagonia on many occasions, cruising the fjords of Chile, sailing the Straits of Magellan in a sea kayak, and serving aboard expedition ships bound from Chilean and Argentinian ports to Antarctica. Using his collection of sea charts of the region, he's writing a history of its exploration and its evolving ecology. His own ships currently include being skipper of the boat Klang II, a 1924 English Channel yawl, and the 1905 Crosby catboat Cape Dame, which he has both restored and currently sails. He's worked as a maritime lecturer for the Cunard, Regent, and Seabourn Cruises all over the world. He was also a journalist aboard the Hanseatic on a voyage to Antarctica retracing Shackleton's expeditions. He has spoken at the United Nations, the Explorers Clubs, the Society of Naval Architects, and there's a lot more. The other side, a music composer and performance artist, he published and edited the renowned Ear magazine, very influential in the worldwide avant-garde music and performance movement of the 80s and 90s. A composer, his signature concert event was Dream Sound, an event for a sleeping audience, which Rip informed me is not to be confused with his more recent lectures on oceanography. Please join me in welcoming Captain Rip to take our helm for the maritime history of the Mediterranean.
Thank you, Mark. I don't actually believe all that myself, but I have been up many a creek and across many a sea, and I'm very happy to be here with all of you. Et spécialement, je voudrais remercier nos amis français pour avoir amené le bateau Heraclitus à Marseille. C'est fantastique d'être ici, à cette belle maison, que j'appelle la domaine de l'imagination. Et il y a ça qui me questionne. Qui sont les écotechniques, les gens écotechniques? Je crois qu'ils sont les voyageurs de la pensée qui peuvent actualiser leur imagination. Well, I'll give up on my French from there. And I revert to my very ordinary, what I call Amglish, which is American English, not to be confused with the real thing. And I'd love to speak more in French, but my vocabulary is not up to it. But today I'm going to talk about the most invasive species of all. Nobody in the room included this way, but after that remarkable and frightening presentation about what's under the sea, I'm going to talk about what's happened on this great sea in the mere history of the maritime of the Mediterranean, which of course goes on with the life of this ship we're going to visit this afternoon. But I was impressed by a number of different things. Yesterday, Daniel Garcia Castellanos talked about the geological history, which of course, as a geologist, you have millions of years to cover, a lot of time to talk about it perhaps. Then you go into history and culture, you have maybe 1,000 years. You have politics that only takes a year or two to decide the next election. Maybe the Califera is one of the faster political forces in the ocean here, but then you have something like the fine cuisine here is the matter of hours. The agriculture takes a few seasons, and of course there's love, which takes just a few minutes. But I'm going to talk about only 5,000 years of history, and that's pretty fast in all of these other terms. And the Mediterranean is, of course, the great lake of civilization where there's been so much competition, and of course this is what famously Homer said, the sea connects but the land divides. And so the cross-cultural fertilization of humanity has been on the Mediterranean, as we well know. And it has a long course, but I would propose in summary of my presentation before I go to my racy slideshow that it is the ship and the vessels that have driven Mediterranean culture and then created the impetus for a lot of world exploration and then the globalization that we know. And so the history of ship construction, nautical science, astronomy, navigation, and then their ancillary trade, warfare, those are what have driven our civilization, and they're very much evidence right here in Marseille and around our journey in the Mediterranean. The other part of that is the endurance of the mythology from the past to the present, and some of the questing and some of the adventurism that is represented by Ecotechnics and the ship especially have a long precedence in, of course, Mediterranean history. And then there's the cycle of exploration, which led to trade, which led to piracy, which led to navies, which led to conquest, which then led to more trade and more piracy, and the cycle sort of goes on as happens now around the world. And the other point I was going to speak of is about the speed of our human time. So, like some of the blooms of algae, things start very slow and then they go so quickly. And so, coming ashore in Marseille, I'm sure our shipmates were impressed by how fast the traffic is and how very much the land is in a great hurry. And all of us are in our expectations of communication, and then also getting places. And I had to wait in the airport for hours to be able to get on a fast plane, and then suddenly I'm here. Whereas I would have rather taken a nice slow boat all the way if I wasn't in a hurry otherwise. So speed is a real problem in our civilization. In some ways we're going far too fast, and I'll show you a bit of that. But before I start, I'd just like to recommend this great book about the Great Sea, which Kathleen kindly lent me to read, and I made it up to about 1382. It's pretty thick reading, but it's a new book by David Abulafia, a great scholar and a great writer. And I think Heraclitus is in the next addendum. But I was out at the helm of my own sailboat in the Atlantic a week or so ago, and I was trying to read this while I was steering. And I almost hit that. We almost hit a whale, actually, in Cape Cod Bay. And I said, you shouldn't read history while you're driving. And but then again, this big book is also a life preserver. Had it been cast off the vessel and swallowed by the whale, I could have hung on to this and perhaps survived. But anyway, thank you for the book. Pass that around. It's a great book. Well, today I'm just going to show you. Actually, can we pull the curtains just to have a little more darkness so that my pictures show up a little more. A lot of this is history you're already familiar with, so I'm going to give you a sweep of maritime history, much of which is familiar to you. So it is posited that the very first people who got on a vessel may have been Africans coming to the Mediterranean, or especially the Red Sea. It is posited that they could see the other shore. Now, you can't do that on much of the Mediterranean, but at Gibraltar and North Africa, or else Egypt and the Red Sea especially, it's thought that the first humans figured out, how can we get across here? And they may have cut trees and gone like a log. They may have seen other animals doing that. And so this is one of the earliest Mediterranean depictions of a vessel. This is actually Minoan. And it is sort of a raft, and maybe they're paddling, but it has that great high stem, which is echoed in other ancient ships. No examples of that exist in archaeology, but here's an Egyptian carving of tribute going to actually to Iraq, obviously across the Mediterranean over the land, then delivered by boat. Our earliest examples of kind of clear depictions were Egyptian, though. So in the murals and various of the temples, depictions like this show the great oar and the steering paddles. These are funereal offerings that show some of the operations. And this may have been a small trading boat on the Nile. They also built fleets to go on the Red Sea that were larger to this extent with the great square rig sail. You notice the double steering oars. Now, the stern rudder post is actually a Chinese invention, did not come to the Mediterranean until about 1400. So steering oars were the traditional way. If you've been to the great Temple of Giza in Cheops, this is the greatest example of an Egyptian vessel, but of course it was built as a funereal vessel and never saw the water. It was purely an offering, but that's a tremendous thing. It's about 30 meters long and quite a remarkable find underground. It probably was painted and decorated much more elaborate originally. But this was the development of the earliest form of ship construction, often planks that were then sewn together with a kind of twine. Then they were pitched. And it's not known really who invented this. Perhaps it was the Phoenicians or the earlier people called the sea people, which is a term that was only created by a French writer in the 1860s to describe some of the descriptions by the Egyptians and the Hittites of the raiding people who came on ocean ships to raid the shore communities. And then they may have become the Phoenicians, who then established the greatest ocean empire of the time. Now, most of our maritime heritage, of course, comes from the Greek heritage, especially a lot of the mythology and the history that we know of the battles all over this area. And so the Aegean has its great gods and goddesses of the sea. Of course, here's Oceanus, the god of the sea, who then wed Tethys, and we heard about her very own Tethys Sea that became the Mediterranean. But it's said that every wave in the ocean is a child of this couple. And then all of the spawning of life in the Mediterranean is descendant from the gods of the sea. So these are depicted in a lot of archaeological sites back when the Mediterranean was absolutely brimming with life. You can imagine how people would go out in a boat and they would be feeling very small, especially when there were larger creatures. There probably were large whales once in the Mediterranean. There certainly were some larger sharks and things that are pretty much gone now. Now we only have to be afraid of that algae that's coming for lunch, perhaps. But so if you know the Greek history, Poseidon became Neptune, of course, and you can go to the great temple of Poseidon that's on the Attic Peninsula, which was a great landmark for ships to come in. It's still on navigational charts. You come up toward Piraeus, and you will see this temple lit up at night, actually, still. And that is a place where I've gone to worship for safety at sea. You know, I always wear a life jacket anyway, but then we have great images like Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who was born on the rocks and out of a shell near the coast of Cyprus. And I've been looking for her at sea for a while, but often they tie me to the mast when I get near. And so here's the other great story from Homer's The Odyssey, and Odysseus going through the Straits of Scylla, the Strait of Messina, and the various mermaids and sea creatures calling to him. And so then he was able to resist by waxing his ears and being tied to the mast. So this is just what used to happen. I don't know. I haven't seen any of those either, though. I've seen some fancy women with feathers before, but none flying around the ship. So here's the mythology that, there's so much of that you could read and enjoy it for yourself. This is, of course, the story of Dionysus, whose vessel was captured by pirates. And in the struggle, he had grapevines grow up all over the mast and the rigging. Now, it's something that the Heraclitus might do if it runs out of wine some days, grow your own aboard like Odysseus. But anyway, he and his sailors fighting the pirates ended up in the ocean, and they turned into dolphins. And ever since then, the dolphin has been a sacred sea creature in the Mediterranean and generally protected because they will save humans that are drowning, including our very own Johnny Dolphin. He'll save you if you're drowning. So here's, that's not Johnny, that's Ryan is his name, who was a young man who used to play the lute. and he would play on the seashore, and the dolphins would come and listen to him. And then he too was on a voyage, and he was bringing gold from Crete to his home island, and again pirates attacked the vessel, and he was going to be executed, except that he begged the pirates to let him play one last song. And as he played his lyre, he jumped into the ocean, and the dolphins came and took him home. And the pirates said, well, that's the end of that fellow. And so they sailed to the island, and they got there, and he was waiting with his father. And the pirates said, oh, well, he fell into the ocean, and now it's ours. But then around came up with his lyre and chased them away. And so, again, it's the story of the dolphins being the best friend of humans in the Mediterranean. Well, then you know a lot of the great wonders of the world, the great lighthouse at Rhodes. There was also the great Pharos at Alexandria, the world's greatest lighthouse, which was then where we get the name Pharo, is from the island of Pharos, which is off of Alexandria. Of course, this is no longer there, though. I understand or read that the island of Rhodos wanted to rebuild this as a great attraction, but they're probably going to make it out of plastic or something instead of what it may have been. This is maybe a great exaggeration. Well, back in many centuries ago, the Mediterranean was the center of the world, has those many names that Mark described before. But beyond that was called the Oceanus Fluvius. Just there was a thought they knew there was water around there, but this was before the Greeks had gone out the Gate of Hercules and the Straits of Gibraltar. They knew that there was the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean and the Black Sea and such, but because of the slow speed of navigation and land travel, people did not go far. And all our stories are fairly much confined to a small area until nautical science developed so that people went farther. The great mythical quester for the Greeks, of course, was Jason and the Argonauts. And this is a complicated story of intrigue with King Peleus and the mother and the murder of this and the cousin of that and such, that Jason was sent off to get the golden fleece. And this is our typical story of, let's say, classic man questing for something beyond and adventuring to go to a place they've never been, in this case going to get the golden fleece at the island of Kochi on the shores of the Black Sea near Georgia. And supposedly, they still to this day, they collect gold in the streams from the Caucasus Mountains by putting a sheep's fleece in the river and leaving it there, and then it gathers gold dust. And that's supposedly the origin of the story. And so Jason and the Argonauts, supposedly 50 sailors, on a ship built called the Argo, made with sacred wood, and Diana blessed the ship, and they painted an eye on it so it would always find its way even in the dark. And so this journey went to the Black Sea, and some have speculated because of the descriptions they also went up the Danube and went around Europe, and it was the first great Greek explorer. Now, this is all classic mythology, so we don't know what the history is, but the story went on, and this desire to go out into the unknown has remained an essential part of Western culture since this era. And of course, then we have Hercules, who was thought to be perhaps one of the mythical people on one of the Argonauts himself. And as some said, hey, nice club. But he, of course, was famously credited with breaking open the sea, and we heard all about the refilling the Mediterranean at geological time. And there's the great gap that then made what was a dry seabed into this great sea. Now, the remnant of that dry bed is actually the Dead Sea, and some salt pans in the Middle East that are remnants that were not filled with the ocean that poured in here. And so that's quite a nautical phenomenon also because of the outflow underneath of the heavier water, more deeper salinity, cold water, or the warmer water, comes out from the Med, and then the Atlantic Ocean water goes in. And so this has led to a curious capability of ships to take, especially submarines during World War II. They could go in at one surface and come out on the other. And U-boats and others would use this current to get in and out of Gibraltar without being detected. They could cut off their motors and just ride the currents back and forth. This had a parallel in the Bosphorus because traditional sail captains in the Bosphorus and pilots would sail out of the Black Sea, which pours out into the Aegean Sea, but if with weights they drop a sail 50 or so meters down, they'd have the upwash going up into the Black Sea, so they would magically pull a boat upstream into the Black Sea using the same phenomena. Well, all of this knowledge of the sea became let's say the great heritage of the Mediterranean sailors and navigators who knew how to get along the coast. So the Phoenicians were certainly the first of the real nations that depended on trade and outpost colonies all through the Mediterranean. It's been called by some scholars the Thalassocrates. I don't want to get my Greek here. Thalassocrates, which means the nations of the sea. And from Phoenicia, Tyre, Byblos, Sidon, the Greek islands, finally the independent kingdom of Sicily, and then other places, trade and navigation, shipbuilding are the essence of the nation. Quite different from the interior areas. So the Phoenicians went, first of all, out Gibraltar. They went looking for the mollusk mussel that made the dye that was prized for purple and indigo and brought it all the way back to the Middle East. They also explored all the way up around the British Isles and the North Sea. And they are said by Herodotus to have sailed all the way around Africa. There's very little evidence of the Phoenicians left except their most important contribution to our culture, which is our alphabet. And all European languages, from Greek to Latin to our modern languages, descend from Phoenician. And you can see in some dictionaries the proto-letters that were the original phonetic alphabet. Of course, one people did not adopt it, even though they were close partners and neighbors of the Phoenicians, that were the Hebrews. And of course, then the Arabic language developed separately. But the other thing that the Phoenicians did is they were able to understand the way the winds move, the currents move, so seasonally they go from one end of the Mediterranean and back. And so every journey was often for many months. And they studied the winds and they created the trade patterns, which remained in the Mediterranean until the age of steam and engines now. So here's a mosaic of one of the Borealis, one of the wind gods. And today with the Mistral, we could feel the strength of the winds that come off the hills. On the other side of the ocean, you have the Sirocco, or the hot wind that blows off of the Sahara. And again, you don't want to be out there for a long time. I was once in Crete, and the whole island was covered with dust from the Sahara. And I hear it even comes up into France sometimes, the big storms that kick up all that dust. And so navigation and sailing very much depended upon the knowledge of all these currents and all these winds. And our inheritance from that knowledge led to our compass rose. So here is a compass. This is actually said to be Magellan's own compass, with the names of the winds: Ostro, Sirocco, Levant, Greco. This is the Italian names: Tramonte, Potente, Garbino. There are other names in French and Greek and such, but they're similar, where the wind rose became the center of the compass, so that you would know your direction by the wind and also by a magnetic compass. Now, the magnetic compass was an inheritance again from the Chinese via the Indian Ocean and the Arabs, and then it was developed into a gimbal set in Italy and then spread around the world, became essential to navigation, though it didn't do Magellan much good. Notice his motto up there, humilitas, which was not really how he acted, but that's another story. Now then, the ship development, that is, again, I consider it essential to the development of our common culture. So here's perhaps what a Phoenician single-masted vessel looked like, with a carvel planking. Again, an inheritance probably from the sea people. We don't know who made the first real ocean-worthy vessel, but there are drawings like this on Greek vases and in inscriptions in Egypt. So other than the sail, then there were the oars been added, the steering. I don't know why he has a ladder there. I guess they ran aground. It's always good to have a ladder on a ship just in case you end up too far inland. And then, of course, the great eye and the rostrum and the ramming front end of the warship. Now, this is a Roman-style naval ship with they call it corvus. But these grew in size. Much of the forests of Greece and the Middle East and all the way to Spain were cut down to build ships. It was the greatest use of wood of all, and that's one reason why there's been such deforestation in ancient times of all of these islands and all of these shorelands. Each ship would take a vast acreage, especially as they started building navies and having tremendous battles. that was a great consumer of not just wood but human life. And I'm going to show you some of the naval history. It's sort of often the same story of conquest and revenge, and it goes on and on and on. Even in that large book, it's who fought who this week. And of course now we hope it isn't going to happen again. But back in the good old days when they took slaves on these ships and they were rowing and ramming, and it was a very exciting life, especially if you were getting the upper deck with the better food when you were a trainite rather than a zagite or a talamite. There are writings that some of these had 40 different levels, probably in extended areas with many different maneuverable capabilities. We only have evidence of a few of them to reconstruct them. There's a couple in Piracy. They actually have a kind of a rowing club that goes out there and gets beaten for exercise. But those are leather guards to keep the sea out, and then there'd be different levels. And they were very dramatic. You can go watch your Ben-Hur and other films of this, often just made little models. But this is one out of Piraeus that they go out and they scare the cruise ships with. Because one of their great features is this great rostrum, which is the great metal front, which was used for ramming sideways and sinking the vessel. Of course, this was pre-firearms. That's why sort of rowing and ramming was the good old way to fight a naval battle. But the name rostrum, as in this, dates from a Roman battle with pirates from Anzio, and one of the Roman admirals took the rostrum off of the conquered ship and took it back to Rome and used it as a podium to speak, and that's why it's called a rostrum to this day. But the Heraclitus, by the way, does not have a rostrum. It's not going to ram anybody. It's not quite fast enough, perhaps. Well, here's another great story. Of course, Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships, so I don't think that's what she really looked like. But then this is actual history, of course. It's been glorified quite a bit, especially in bigger movies, but this is the classic story of warfare in the Aegean and the Trojan horse and the sack of Troy, and you've seen this movie before, but the persistence of warfare in ancient times and up to the present is just, unfortunately, one of the greater legacies, the sadder legacy of the Mediterranean, because there's no other sea in the world that's ever had so much warfare. For instance, the Indian Ocean is mostly commerce, and there's never been any major sea battles until recent times. And the Pacific is fairly Pacific, and even the Sea of Japan and such have never had such battles like the Mediterranean has had constant warfare between all these parties. Maybe it's because the shores are close enough so that they know somebody's there and they're going to go get them, conquer this. So the Greeks took Syracuse and the Carthaginians came back, and of course Archimedes helped defend the city of Syracuse at the time, but I think it was Pliny wrote that never were so many ships battling in such close quarters, so they just filled up the harbor. And other sieges of Tyre, for instance, by the Romans and by the Greeks, just went on and on. So when there was a great naval victory or when there was a big new vessel launched, there was often a coin struck. And that's often the record of certain vessels and certain battles, as we have this kind of mementos from the time. The Romans were not originally a maritime people. Any Romans in the audience, you may say nay if you want, but they were the land people who were driven into naval warfare by competition for grain, and they had trade to Egypt and brought the grain from Egypt to feed the Roman people. All citizens of Rome got free grain, which depended on trade to the port of Ostia, but then they were attacked by the Carthaginians and by pirates, so they developed a navy that fought like they were on land. They had this corvus or bridge that would come down, and they'd march with their shields and their short Roman swords, and they were very effective. And of course, then they ended up beating the Carthaginians in the 4 Punic Wars. So the Carthaginians, who were the descendants of the Phoenicians, were much more adept in shipbuilding, but not as good in fighting. And so eventually, the long story, Hannibal went around to invade. Meanwhile, the Romans attacked Carthage and sacked it, and so that whole story went on. But that led to the great Pax Romana, where sometimes it didn't work well. Here's one of the consuls who's throwing sacred chickens overboard, which is a sacrilege, and they lost that particular battle because of the spirits. Then you had the great battle of Actium, where Mark Antony versus Octavius, and that's Cleopatra fleeing ahead of the battle, and of course the rest is a Hollywood ending. But more typical, between all these fits of warfare, there was trade, and that's what built the nations, built the economies of all these places, because the south coast of the Mediterranean had fruit and grain, wild animals, and things that they didn't have north. For instance, aubergine, eggplant, oranges, all these things that we enjoy here originally came from Africa. And that was then traded for wine, olives, all the things that everybody now is common food from the Mediterranean. So these more humble vessels that were just traders carried amphora. And the development of trading ships also led to construction of ships that were far more stable. They could carry a lot more. They learned what's called dunnage, which means how to pack a ship and how things can arrive safely, be unloaded efficiently. And so that was, again, a Mediterranean development. Here's a later vessel. They call these round ships because they were sort of built to bob in the sea. They were not made for warfare. They were not made for speed, but they had a deep hold to carry goods across the Mediterranean. If you've ever been to Heraklion in Crete, you can see the great Venetian ship warehouses that are now inland because they put a highway and filled in the harbor, alas. But you can see how they used to park the trading ships and also the warships right on the shore in these sort of covered pens so they could work on them. Later, shipbuilding got larger, developed more rigging, better tools. The impetus for shipbuilding could not be done without the right tools. So it was in the Bronze Age that it's thought that the first axe and chisel could cut enough wood to build something. And then later with iron and then steel, the techniques for shipbuilding got better with keels. And then they have this great lateen rig, which is a great sprit hoisted up the mast, in this case 3 rigs, and be tied forward. So it can go very well to the wind. Now this kind of rigging is both very adaptable, and it's also, you can drop it very quickly in a storm. It then became what's now in a modern sailboat called a Marconi rig, a triangular sail with a firm luff ahead at the head of the vessel will drive it closer to the wind. All other vessels were only good downwind until this rig was invented. Then it became quite elaborate. In this illustration, you see both the lateen rig and all the galley and lots of flags and trumpets getting going. I don't know if trumpets will drive a sail, though. Maybe we should try that in the calm on the Heraclitus, break out the band. Later ships developed kind of fortresses. So you have a forecastle, or the forecastle, for fighting, and then you have an aft construction for the helm. And then by this time they've had the stem rudder on a whipstaff, and then later on a wheel, and developed from there. But this was the kind of ship that had a lower center for boarding and for loading, and then they had the fortresses for fighting on either end. What I have not been able to find out is who invented the block and tackle. Now this is an illustration of a fellow going up there to check the rigging, but that particular wheel and line became an essential part of the development of larger rigging, especially as ships end up with many sails and much more adaptability. Another Mediterranean invention is the first of the divers. Now, I don't know what he sort of looks like a bit of a ghost with that long hat. I guess it's a breathing apparatus. Have you ever tried one like that? Well, I wouldn't recommend it, especially trying to lift a cannon. But let's say marine salvage goes back 1,000 or more years in the Mediterranean. So when ships would sink near shore and they knew what was on board, they'd send a fellow like that down. I don't know if he made it back up, though. Well, of course, nowadays we can go down and find many things. So the Mediterranean is certainly the greatest lode of marine archaeology in the world, other than maybe the coast of China. But in most places, you're not allowed to dive without a permit. And it's none of this free-range diving like you get in other places. Already, many sites have been picked over, but every year they're keeping finding all these wrecks with amphora and silver, gold, such. I think the biggest wreck is off of Minorca, a British ship, the Sussex, which sank in the 1680s with a load of bullion to go to Naples or somewhere. And the Spanish government and the British government and the diving company are still in court deciding what they're going to do when they bring it up. But it's a big business now, bringing these things up, and who knows what else is down in the sea. So, as a sailor, I always look for friends out there, and they say when you've seen one mermaid, you haven't seen them all. So Maybe I took this picture off of the Heraclitus. No, that was last year. And so the image of humanity joining, let's say, symbiotic coevolution. In the future, this may be true. Here, this Greek goddess is towing the ship, which may have run out of coal back then. I don't know what, but as one mermaid said to the other, "Oh, how was your merman last night?" And she said, "Oh, he was okay, but he was bony and very hard to fillet." So this is not fiction. This is a real mermaid on a beach, I think, somewhere near Nice. But anyway, I will regress into history. So as the Mediterranean was known, it became known as the center of the world, of course, because all the known world revolved around it. Chinese have a different opinion about that. But here you have Mare Magnum in Africa, Europe, Asia, and some of the maps, it's called a T&O map in medieval cartography. And Jerusalem was considered the center of the world, especially what they call the Sea of Faith and the religious fervors of the era. And this developed with more accurate cartography, especially here's sort of the Mediterranean, and that's the Red Sea over there, conveniently red at the time, often by a plankton bloom, isn't it? It's the right time of year. But the best cartographers in the medieval time were actually the Arab, and this fellow was actually Moroccan. Al-Idrisi was a noble, very well-educated Moroccan who came in service of the Norman king of Sicily, Roger. And he commissioned a map of the world and then the very careful delineations of the coast for expanding his empire, knowing what the world was. So this is one of the more accurate maps of the era. And then, of course, it ended up in our modern era. Now, this is a typical map that was what they call the South Up, which you see Italy and France is on the bottom of the map. Most Arabic maps were in that time were like this. And of course it's a way of thinking about the world. So if you've ever been down under, they have maps of Australia's view of the rest of the world the same way. Australia is on top. But this is more the way we know it. And of course cartography became very essential to the navigation. And then also the portolanos, the pilot descriptions, the information about ports, all these things became actually very coveted and actually state secrets, so that any navigator would carry his instruments and his portolano with him and would never share it unless he was doing business or ordered by his rulers. Famously, the Portuguese never shared that information, but it leaked out as they went around the world. But what happened in the Mediterranean is, as it developed, the economy was such, the piracy plagued the trade, and the navies had to have fortresses, and so you have constructions like this all over the Mediterranean, and it's one of the great legacies back before cannons destroyed castles. This is how many traders kept their livelihood by hiding behind the walls at the right time and also developing navies. But here's a French town not far from here, Cunard, which is the Dead Waters. This was built on the shore, and it's all silted in the river, so it's no longer a port, but the fortress remains from probably the 1300s. I've never visited there. But these kind of fortifications were, the outposts of traders and the strongholds that were then had the impetus for protection for trade. So here is Napoli. And so you had a fortress and then buildings on high and a great harbor. And so as population expanded and ships got better, these key ports were often fought over, and especially even in Italy, but from Genoa to Napoli to Venezia and all that, they were all independent kingdoms, and they all had their own navies, and the history has them fighting over all sorts of places along the coast and down to Africa. Well, here's the French coast near here with one of the mountaintop villages. Ez. And of course, it's quite a hike, but that was the safe place to be away from pirates, especially. Another feature of the Mediterranean maritime is that there was, of course, the Crusades, and a lot of the fervor for the Crusades was, to retake Jerusalem from the Muslims. But it was said if you could survive the boat ride, that showed your penance, just like St. Paul or Jonah and the whale, tossed in the storm. And St. Paul was an example. He was a slave to the Romans, shipwrecked on Malta, supposedly converted all the Maltese to Christianity, And then he was finally taken to Rome, where he was properly beheaded and became a martyr of the church. Well, back in the Crusades, they'd load up all kinds of people who'd never been on a ship before, send them off to the Levant to the end of their life, perhaps. And this is still a historical hangover because many people in the Middle East and the Muslims still talk about the Crusades as if it was just last month. But of course, it was a terrible battles for centuries and full of intrigue. And here's the case of a man named Leo, who was a Byzantine who converted to Islam and then went back and attacked Constantinople. So, it was a very unruly time. Then the development of armaments changed all of the game, I guess. Here's Greek fire, which is a kind of a naphtha or a petroleum jelly that was spewed out on ships, and that defended Byzantium and Constantinople from its enemies for a while. But the Venetians actually took over much. They attacked Constantinople and took it and helped set up the great Venetian trading routes and empire. Of course, this is the great marriage of the waters, and Venice is the classic maritime nation in its time. And they still have the ceremony off the Armada there. But when Venice took Constantinople, that sort of began the demise of the Eastern Empire and eventually led to the conquest by the Turks. This had a great fleets of galleons going around all over attacking each other, and this depended on slave labor. And again, an unfortunate heritage of the Mediterranean is that they were slave raiding by all parties, and what they used to call the black, white, or olive, depending on where you got your slaves for whom. One of the largest slave traders in the Mediterranean through the middle 12 to 1400s were the Catalans in Barcelona, which continued as a tradition as slaveholders in the Americas. But that's not usually on the brochures in Barcelona. But anyway, these guys got a regular job, and they got regular food, no health benefits. But they go up and they on the South Shore, they go raid the French, Italian, Spanish coast, Greek coast, and they take them and sell them in Algiers. And similarly, what they call the corsairs, Christians would go down and grab people from the South, often enslave them as domestic servants, not so much hard labor. But here's the slave market in Algiers, a later painting of it. And supposedly, one European woman was worth one onion. I guess onions were pretty precious. I'd pay 2 onions for her myself. But, of course, this is a cultural heritage. We have a divided cultural, religious world in the Mediterranean, which we know much about. And when the Ottoman Empire was established, took Constantinople and then expanded throughout the Middle East through the Great Caliphate and the great pashas of Istanbul, this became a mortal threat to Christian Europe. And it was Suleiman who predicted that he would finally take Malta, Sicily, Italy, and then conquer the rest of Europe. Once he could take Italy, the rest would be easy with his large armies from the east. And it was led on the water by the great admirals. There were a few of them, fathers, sons, called Barbarossa. And they did have sort of reddish beard and were great tacticians of the galleons. They came and they attacked with ships this size, tremendous, great sailing and rowing fleets. And they came and attacked, this is in Genoa. They came and sacked Nice. Charles V, the great Habsburg emperor, who was originally Flemish, but he was in Spain, and then he gathered the Christian forces, and then they attacked back in Tunis. So this is the terrible history, Provenza, where the Ottomans and Barbarossa were victorious. So it goes back and forth like this quite a bit. Here's the siege of Nice. I think it's over now, but it was very much religiously driven, we versus them. And here you have Pax Evangelis, etc., over the sea. So this is actually Crete, the island, which was held along with Rhodos, where the Knights of Templar, and also they were based in Malta, and they were the front line versus the Ottoman Empire. They lost one city in the middle, on the Levant, Jerusalem, and then Byblos, and all of them were lost to the Saracen and the various other Muslim armies. But at sea, they finally came to a head at the Siege of Malta, where Barbarossa led the much larger Ottoman fleet with all of its Muslim allies from other parts, and surrounded the Knights of Templar in the harbor in Valletta, and they fought over the land, and only by great effort of Jean de la Valette were the Christians and the Knights of Malta victorious. Otherwise, if Malta had fallen in this terrible battle, went on for a couple of years, it would have been different, because then they would have jumped on to Sicily, and they would have gone on to Naples, and perhaps the Ottoman Empire would have extended all the way up to the Alps. So there was an awful lot of fighting over all kinds of places. But we also go on a little further when, again, the Christian forces, led by, this case, Don Juan of Austria, again faced the Ottoman fleet at near Gulf of Corinth at Lepanto. And this was the largest naval battle in history until World War II, where the Christian galleys bottled up the Turkish fleet in the bay, and then they came out. They were massed in tremendous formations. But the Venetians in particular had these great warships that were quasi-armored, and they also spit fire. They broke through the Ottoman ranks and caused great turmoil and loss of life. Some 40,000 sailors were killed in this battle alone, but it stopped the Ottoman Empire from taking over further. So here's some of the great illustrations of it and the glory of warfare, if you think so. I'm glad I missed that show. But it was one of those turning points in Mediterranean history, along with many other battles. So I'll go on. There's too many tales to tell on these battles and the specifics of their tactics and such. But what it did is it drove the development of the ship construction, especially. But here's an illustration of the Pope and the nobles of Europe gathering the Turkish fleet like a bunch of fish for lunch, which is a short way to look at it. But anyway, the later various Mediterranean ports were more cooperative. Here's this is actually an illustration of Mahan in Minorca, where the trading empire for the British extended into the Mediterranean. Many nations cooperated when they weren't at war. They did a lot of trade. Here looks like some Quaker gentlemen doing some deal with some pasha somewhere. I don't know quite where this is. But the battles went on. Here's the Russians battled in the Black Sea with the Ottoman fleet. And one time after the other, the superior armaments of one nation tended to beat the Turks at their own game. As the ships developed, they developed much greater rigs. Now, this is really an ocean rig that was developed in the North Sea around by explorers. But what it meant is they no longer, they had such a big ship with so many armaments, there was no point in rowing. You wouldn't get very far. So instead, they had a highly developed sail rig, which took a lot of manpower, a lot of technical line handling. But that meant that the Mediterranean was suddenly filled with warships like this, which were essentially big fortresses with great cannon, and they just lumber around. They were not built for speed or ramming anybody. They just get close enough to bombard them, and that goes on to this day. So here are a few illustrations of these great ships of the line, they were called. So they would be ranked in 20, 40, 60 guns. Some of them were so big they could hardly move, and they had frigates to do picket work. They're sort of like the aircraft carrier of today. They were sort of the mothership that was impregnable, and then would get in and blast everybody away. Another great Chinese invention, gunpowder, changed the Mediterranean history. So this is where the son of the guns were born, or son of the beach was he, however the song goes. But some of our British friends may remember this illustration, which is they're out there fighting the Barbary pirates or the enemy or whatever, and so the sailor's saying, I was praying that you'd get as much of the enemy shot in proportion to our prize money, which is greatest among the officers. So at that time, there's sort of an official piracy in that if you had a letter of marque, you could go capture an enemy ship and then take it in, and you get the proceeds from the ship. So there's a lot of sort of semi-official piracy that went on, and then the great battles between the bigger naval powers. Now, in 1704, the French and the British English fleet, before the Union, stood off at Malaga, and by tactical error, this time the French fleet won, and it was later that Gibraltar, by the Treaty of Trent, was given to the UK, and that's still an issue. But at that particular battle, it was in this turbulent water, which is one of the problems for fighting one of these standing in line kind of naval warfare, is that things can go wrong just because your ship would be swept away. Now, Admiral Byng famously was court-martialed and executed for the loss of that battle. And as Voltaire said, he was executed so as to encourage the others to do better. But there were others who did do better and became great martyrs. Of course, Lord Nelson got picked off by French snipers because he wore so many medals. That's why it's good not to get too overdressed for battle. Earlier, he had been in charge of the English fleet based in Naples, and when there was an uprising by one of the admirals of the fleet of Naples against the king, he was summarily executed and thrown off the ship. It's a famous painting of, I think it was his name, Caracolo, his name, the admiral. But of course, this was also where Lord Nelson met Madame Hamilton, right, and took up his affair and made his life. Well, later he met Admiral Bray, and at the time the French had taken Egypt, based from the fleet in Toulon. They went down and they had their conquest and famous expedition in Egypt. But then they met their match at the Battle of the Nile, 1798, when Nelson led the fleet in, bottled up the French fleet at Aboukir, and then in this great classic line of bombarding each other, the French fleet took such losses that that sort of finished off the fleet for the time, and there was a lot of hand-to-hand combat. I'm only showing these pictures because they're so well painted. I kind of like to see the detail. Not that the story is so interesting, but this is the great painting of L'Orient, the flagship, that blew up when it was finally assaulted enough, but not a happy day. And of course, the English sort of clucked about it in this way. So the European adventurism into North Africa, of course, has a long history, and some might say it's going on to this day, because even with when the Ottoman Empire, with its suzerainities across to Morocco, were in great contrast to the Christian Western nations, the intrigue went on, and so the battle over the Nile and other key points like Malta, Sicily, were key to the control of the Mediterranean. Even in times of peace, though, there were pirates. So here's some of the Barbary pirates that would come out of Algiers or Tunis or other ports on the north coast, and they would prey upon the slower trading vessels. And often they'd go up and they'd threaten warfare, and they'd be paid a ransom. And occasionally there'd be an attack on their strongholds, like here's some pirates that were caught off of Algiers and given the old 1-2. Nowadays they give them room and board and a trial, but we won't go into that. When the American nation started its trade in the Mediterranean independently, of course, it lost the protection of the Royal Navy. And by President Jefferson's policies, you don't give in to terrorists, you don't pay any ransom. So, of course, the American ships were captured and they were held. And so then this Captain Bainbridge went to Tripoli to negotiate for the release of some ship. This is the Philadelphia that had been captured, and they got aboard and they made it a fire ship, blew it up. Later, the Marines came, landed, and then, of course, fought the Barbary pirates. It was in the halls of Montezuma, so the shores of Tripoli, the U.S. Marine song. And so this is sort of the first naval action of the United States Navy and Marines in the Mediterranean. And this, again, graphic pictures of the excitement. But what it did mean is that the pirates on the Barbary coast were repeatedly assaulted and finally pacified, often with the cooperation of other nations like Morocco, which had an anti-piracy treaty for a long time. But, of course, this problem has gone on in some ways. So here's another assault on, this would be in what's now Tunisia, by Italians carrying a torch of freedom and civilization. So it's been very much of a problem that, let's say, turmoil in one place is matched by imperialism or intervention on another. This is my favorite example of it. There's this volcano off of Sicily on the west shore called Fernandea, which is a volcanic peak that rose up out of the water, spewing, and it was sighted by some traders or fishermen, and the English vessel went from Malta to go plant a Union Jack on a claim. This is about 1832. And then when the King of Sicily heard that the English had taken an island that's right near Sicily, he went and had his crew throw off the flag, plant his flag there, and name it after him. And then the island exploded and went down into the sea. I guess it just didn't want to deal with politics. Then in 1984, a U.S. Sixth Fleet was going by with airplane surveillance, and they saw this thing under the water. They thought it was a submarine in attack. What it was is the island was coming back up. So they bombed it back down into the sea. So it's no. So that shows you a little preventive geology goes a long way. So I don't know if it ever comes back up, I think we should put an Ecotechnics flag on it and say, don't touch our island. Anyway, but trade went on. All this warfare is. Someone said that it may be all paintings and glory and flags and all that stuff, but most people had a fairly mundane life, just trading what they had and having a normal life, which is what we. I'm in the merchant marine, so I believe in peace and trade versus all this bombardments. So again, here's an English and a Russian combined fleet fighting the Ottomans, and again they got licked there to control the Black Sea. Of course, then the Russians and the English started fighting. Here's the Italians and the Austrians fighting, which one of the last examples of ramming another ship. You see, he still has the rostrum on this, and they were sort of ironclad at the time. But even Garibaldi got into the act by taking a paddle wheeler to land his troops to, continue the unification of Italy. And then the greater fleets came in. For instance, here these British dreadnoughts come into what was presumed to be a British lake at this time, where the Royal Navy was the largest and had these tremendous big ships that patrolled around. This is prior to World War I. But this is very much what happened in the Mediterranean. One power after another would establish hegemony. So maybe it was the Phoenicians, but they were not too many people to fight back there. But certainly the Romans, the Pax Romana, then the Pax Britannica, and then various others have assumed the title. And once there's a dominant power, there's often more trade and more commerce and more benefit for people. But there's also been other key developments in the Med. For instance, the Great Corinth Canal, which was, of course, the isthmus of the Peloponnese that used to have slaves would drag boats over the hill. It's called the doplio, the Greek name for it. And it was a famous way to cut the long journey around the Peloponnese to get to the Ionian Sea. And Aristophanes described the hauling of the boats up and then down like a sex act. They take it up there, they pull it back, and they come back over. And they developed a certain coin, which was the common coinage to pay for the carrying over the Corinth. And then they cut this canal. But by the time they cut it, the ships had gotten too big to go through it. So now it's just an excursion canal if you've ever been there. It's quite dramatic, and they do bungee jumping off of the bridges now. Also a new invention. The other great change for the Med was, of course, the Suez Canal and the traffic that opened up the Med as a conduit between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. And so that greatly boosted trade throughout, especially the Indian Ocean, and saved that long haul around Africa, similar to how the Panama Canal saved the long haul around South America. But notice the great feluccas. You don't see any of those anymore. But this was, of course, a great prize that was, it's its own story, built by the great engineer Ferdinand Lesseps under French sponsorship, and then finished under British control, and now it's under Egyptian control. And of course, it had been closed during the Six-Day War for a while. But the troubles have gone on. Now here's World War I. Our Aussie friends will know this very well. The battle on the Dardanelles, Gallipoli, the great disaster when they sent the fleet up to take the Dardanelles to supply Russia, and the great conflict of World War I. And this ended up to be a great tragedy and disaster, though the Turks were very kind to bury all the poor victims of their battle. They got encircled and contained. But the naval history was, a matter of technical development. So the Mediterranean and all these navies, they developed all these weaponry, which we have gone from, let's say, good old slashing with a sword to now tremendous armaments like this, or even, let's say, the Ecocet ship missile things, guided missiles, all kinds of stuff. So the stakes have gone up tremendously. Back when it was just a few people fighting to the death, that's one thing. Now we have the potential for mass disaster, industrialized warfare, which in many ways was embedded in the Mediterranean. And then, of course, it had its greatest last display in World War II. So here's the French fleet at Mers el-Kébir, which was attacked. And then at Toulon, the fleet was scuttled. And then there was all kinds of battles in various other parts of the Mediterranean. So there's a lot of wrecks that are still out there from this terrible conflict. And it went down to Tripoli and all around Italy again. So again, this whole battle over the control of the sea, it could have gone the other way. I'll leave it at that. Meanwhile, Other things have happened, for instance, the Exodus ship, that's part of the heritage, the founding of the State of Israel, and the problems that go on to this day, now with the Gaza and the blockade and all those sort of things. The last great battle was actually the 6 Days War in 1967, but nowadays this is the sort of creatures that patrol the Mediterranean, along with the NATO other vessels. The U.S. Sixth Fleet is by far the largest and I would say overfunded of the bunch. So this is the behemoth, the great sea monsters that patrol all of the oceans and keep a lid on potential trouble. And so you can think of these things sort of popping up in the middle of your harbor somewhere. Unfortunately, all of the old warships that broke up and were broken, no matter how much was blood and gold was lost in them, they were not poisonous to the ocean. One of these goes down or is destroyed. Along with all the modern construction, they become very toxic for the sea. This was the last real sea engagement in the 6 Day War, where the Israeli Navy and Egyptian and others fought on the sea, including attacking American surveillance ship. So hopefully these sort of things will not go on. This is the coal, which of course was damaged off of Aden in Yemen, but it came towed all the way through the Mediterranean to go get repaired. And then, of course, recently we've had other conflicts in the area, and I don't want to go into politics, except I consider the whole thing a great historic error. And here's our contemporary culture where, curiously, our allies in the Middle East presented the U.S. Marine, they call the Mameluke sword, which was the stylus sword captured from the Barbary pirates and is an honorary presentation sword given to our new now allies. So it's a curious world. But hopefully this is what it will be. No more of this trouble. The Union of the Mediterranean has been developed by the EU that includes the nations of North Africa, will hopefully solve all of this rampant battles for control and let people be. Now, the other side of this, the sea has changed, the economies have changed. You have traditional fishing in great decline, traditional crafts, and so the mission of the Heraclitus is very important to be in these places while people can still tell the tales of our recent industry or culture before it's all replaced by other things. So you don't see much of this free sponge divers in Greece anymore. And this is the salt pans on the Rhone, not far from here. And a lot of this just is handwork that is no longer part of the Mediterranean culture, although I think there's still sea salt produced. But what's happened, of course, is tourism and, let's say, the modern mythology of going to the beach, relaxing, having all your time, and I call this as the mythology that draws everybody there to sometimes a rather uncomfortable lifestyle on the beach. How crowded can it get? So there's supposed to be some 300 million people a year come to vacation on the shores of the Mediterranean, and not just the north coast, all the south coast, all the resorts developing all across down to the Red Sea. I mean, this is one of the benefits of peace and prosperity. People actually can go enjoy it. But of course, other people used to do this. You think the bikini was invented just not long ago? Well, there you go. There's Coco Chanel and her mosaic period, or whoever invented the bikini. I don't know, but that's people have been having a good time on the Mediterranean for quite a while, and there's no reason to stop now. But of course, there's a price to pay. So you have some 2 to 3 million private recreational vessels that are, as we described, all the harbors. I mean, there's just a flood of private vessels, and then, it's a great sport and a great way to enjoy the ocean. But there's an old saying: those who would go to sea for pleasure should go to hell for a holiday. Nobody used to go out to have fun like we hope we do now. But it's contrasted with this, which is the demographics of the Mediterranean now. It used to be the north coast. The European coast had far more people than the North African coast. Now the changes in demographics means that there's going to be a few extra 100 million Middle Easterns and North Africans looking to do this. And so this is, of course, we know about this problem, and so they're not out there for yachting, that's for sure. Now, some of the traditional boats continue. This was in the harbor in Barcelona. It's called a barca, which has the Latin rig, and they take kids out. There used to be a fishing vessel, and they trawl for this, that, or the other. Now there's not so much fish, so they trawl with kids. And there's other historic vessels. Again, off of Barcelona, so this old schooner. The Med used to be full of this kind of ship. This is only the style of maybe 100 to 200 years ago. But these are kind of trading vessels in recent time until the steam engine. And of course now you have these great ferry boats and Tremendous naval architecture has shrunk the size of the Mediterranean so you can get across it in comfort and Wi-Fi and the whole thing nowadays. But I'd say they have a price to pay, even though they don't dump oil in the ocean and such. They go all over the place. So there's a kind of if you go out on the Med, and especially in the contained seas, the Adriatic and the Mediterranean and close areas, you'll see diesel or marine fuel haze over the water. It looks like the brown haze like you see over any city. And so all these places are suddenly connected in a matter of hours, which, again, I think helps ensure the peace of the region because the economy and the cultures have sort of bound together by transportation. And you can take your pick where you're going to go next year. It's really quite a remarkable development considering how much trouble it used to be to get across from one side to the other. So you can see these great, they call wave-slicing bows. Some of them are very big, like cruise ships, have all these facilities. But they go so fast and they're so high-powered that they actually turn up a terrible amount of wake. And I've been on ships so much of my life, I've been staring at wakes for years, and I say, well, that can't be efficient. What marine animal just spews so much energy off just to get going? I liken it to trying to run somewhere on roller skates. So there's a tremendous amount of energy, and the engine's delivered for relatively little motion. Some estimates are 30 to 40% of the engine is delivered in actual direction. So one of my projects in the recent years is designed a new propulsion system on a hull like this, which is the new swath, high catamaran style, that is highly efficient as a hull, but to combine that with a new kind of propulsion system, and this is a general sketch. It's sort of a helix vortex-producing propulsive device. You're the first people I've ever shown this to other than my colleagues, and this is just the original sketch. We have actually working models now, and driven by electromagnetic force so that it would actually draw the ship along and not have a wake at all, just like your porpoise or your dolphin. So this may change the way people get around with greater efficiency, also with less impact on the water, the great churning of the water. Other projects include putting a bridge across the Sicily, right across the straits there in Messina, and that may or may not happen if you go there. They're always arguing about it. You may know that one. And also bridges across the Dardanelles joining Asia Minor with Europe. That's been going on for quite a while. Now, somebody lives on one of these islands. Who lives on that island? I don't know if there's a bridge to it, but often a bridge will ruin the island culture. There's no bridge there, is there? No. Or tunnels. This is the infrastructure in the Med is a tremendous business, like all the landfills and the harbors and all this. Now they're big projects, particularly to the Sea of Marmara, and the Turkish government has just announced that to protect Istanbul from the traffic that comes tearing through the town, all these, particularly Russian and other freighters come up and down right through the downtown, and occasionally they've run down the ferry boats or crashed into the shore and harmed a lot of people. So now they're planning to build a canal, which will cut right inland of Istanbul, and then this will be a great relief to the traffic. It'll also mean a change in the ecology and the flow, because the Black Sea pours into the Med. So they're trying to understand what that will do to the Sea of Marmara. Of course, this is a highly urbanized area, and you can imagine thousands of ships trying to get through there. They're not stopping there. They're just getting through. So this does make a lot of sense, and again, it'll open up another avenue for ever greater traffic. Here's a Turkish illustration of it. So this is kind of engineering that fundamentally changes the Mediterranean for navigation and maritime, but it also has a lot of ecological effects. Danielle the other day had this project up, which is the Anthropa project of the engineer Sogol in the 1920s and 30s, and it was proposed to dam at Gibraltar, and you saw some of this yesterday, that would then drop the level and create what Sogol described as Lebensraum. There'd be plenty of new agricultural land, a lot more productivity of the land, but completely at the expense of the marine life. And of course, isolating many places from the sea, requiring all this new construction. I mean, this is sort of an engineering fantasy going wild. Also to have, Autobahn all the way down to North Africa, to re-green Africa. And of course, this may actually have to be done. I don't know if it'll ever quite be realized this way, but for instance, if the general world ocean rises, how many meters will the Mediterranean and all of the hundreds of millions of people be flooded out, or should it become a lake again, just to preserve it as is. I have not heard of a proposal like that, but if within 100 years the Mediterranean is flooding out every port city and every delta and every land that are very productive, maybe this will have to be done. It also depends on climate change. So if there's a certain predictions say that it'll get much warmer in northern Europe and cooler, wetter in the Mediterranean area. But if it's different, it may make northern Europe much colder and North Africa much hotter. So we just don't know. So Venice, places like this may turn like that. We don't know. And I'll finish just with a little climate change sculpture for you. We have to beg Titan to blow its horn for the future, because we know there will be a future. And if you know the mythology, he raises sea children who become the future generations. And here's a few. Again, an actual photograph. Now, I'm going to finish with just the last view of this great ship. And my first night here, the Mistral was blowing. I had a dream that I was a little barnacle larvae, and I was looking at all these ships go by around Marseille. And I saw one that I thought I'd like to stick to, and it's that one. And so here we are. What does this eye see? It's seen a lot, and it saw this off of Valencia. Remember this island? Yeah. This was blinking back at the Heraclitus, and of course this is there's always a place in the Med you've never seen before. You may name that after who you like. And then we saw this, a sunfish, and then we saw, a mermaid, and something in the bucket. Does anybody know what that is? Velero, okay, see? I'm glad somebody knows it. There were thousands of them floating in the sea. It's a little jellyfish. And so these are the new Argonauts. And I think that's Jason. And, they're out there looking for the golden fleece or the golden grant, whichever it is nowadays, with the adventurers of our modern era and mythology. And it takes a lot of courage, a lot of strength to run a ship like this. So I admire you all, and I wish you on. I hope I can sail with you. Again, though, crew discipline is always a problem, especially on expeditionary voyages, so there's always a method. Okay. All right, enough of that. Yeah. So, in the future, we shall see how I'll leave you with one last saying, which Helum non animan mutat qui trans mare current. Those who hurry across the sea cannot change their spirit. So again, about speed, if you slow down, you'll see things you'll never see, like taking a walk versus zipping on a highway. So may that be our motto, so that we take our time to appreciate the world we're in. Thank you very much.
Totally marvelous talk.